Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I am Abe with mysticgenmara.com, and sorry about the light. It's really early in the day here, so I have got a beautiful south-facing window, and right now it's blaring in even with the blinds closed. So that's where we're at. Anyway, today I was going to do a book review, and I'm doing this as a pre-record because I have another project I am working on this evening, so I won't be live for that. But the book that I want to cover is called Evil Archaeology: Demons, Possessions, and Sinister Relics by an author. She's actually a full-blown PhD archaeologist who apparently has interests along my line of thinking, but her name is Dr. Heather Lynn, and there's a link in the description if you're interested in this type of work. She is a professional historian and renegade archaeologist is how she has it on her little blurb on the back. On a quest to uncover the truth behind ancient mysteries. She has been on programs like Coast to Coast AM, which is kind of an ancient alien type show, but he does a lot of other occult or subversive alternative history type stuff. It's actually kind of a fun show. I've only caught clips of it, but the ones I've seen I've enjoyed. But she's also written other books, but she consults with Ancient Aliens, which is one of my favorite shows on the planet. But basically what this book is and why it caught my attention is she goes through and explains kind of where a lot of the modern day obsession with horror films comes from. And then she has random quotes throughout here from different people. Like there's one in here from Aristotle: fears pain arising from the anticipation of evil. But she starts off kind of going over, I had bookmarks in it and I kicked it this morning accidentally and it went all over the place, so I do apologize for that. Because she kind of introduces it with the beginning scene from The Exorcist, which if you've read the book, that's awesome. The movie's pretty good itself too, but it's from William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist. At a place of Ashurbanipal, he paused, then shifted a sidelong glance to the limestone statue hulking in the situ. Ragged wings, taloned feet, bulbous, jutting, stubby male parts, and a mouth stretched taut in a feral grin, the demon Pazuzu. But she kind of goes through how the demon that is in the movie is not exactly the demon, quote unquote, of the time. Pazuzu, in the ancient times, he wasn't the dark one, it was his wife. And he was so fearsome because he had to basically keep humanity from interacting with her because she was really crazy. She was sterile, and so she couldn't actually bear her own children, and so he would have to basically fight her to keep her away from stealing human infants, because that's one of the things that she liked to do, was steal children. And it's interesting because you go through this and just the way she describes it, it makes it a little bit more clear. Like, the movie's still scary in its own right, don't get me wrong, and I'm not going to turn my back on horror films just because I learned a little bit more about them. But she goes through, like, is demon possession psychological? Is there something else going on there? A little bit of the history from the church's standpoint, going back even beyond the church, before the church, before the 600 AD or so time period. And then you had people that she gives some different stories along the lines, some random black and white images, kind of like this, that are known as, like, this one's called the Hell Plaque. It's an amulet held by a demon Pazuzu that would be placed by the bedside of the possessed. It depicts the demon Lamashtu, Pazuzu's wife, on the front. It's basically his way of calling her away from the possessed person, because Pazuzu, back in the original, it's implied that he was actually the king of demons, so he could command them and call them away from a person. And that's why you would use his symbol in exorcism rites, is because you had basically he was there to in one of the beliefs that was as out there, he would be there to rein in and corral his evil, hateful, spiteful wife. And that was the purpose of him being there, was to pull away the demonic energy. But then he talks about, she goes through different areas like the Egyptian and Sekhmet, the Mesopotamian demons, and it just kind of goes over the history of how we ended up with some of the modern day icons that we use in horror films, like Cernunnos, the horned god of the Celtics. We use a lot of horned deities and demons in our modern day horror books and movies, and it's because they would there was a very well coordinated attack on these ancient deities, oddly enough this is historical, I'm not picking on anybody, but it was done by the ancient Catholic Church. They didn't like the fact that people were worshiping a deity other than the one they chose. And you can have your own beliefs, that's fine. This is research that I've done, and it's interesting. But there still always were groups that were like, to heck with you guys, we're still going to have our old world deities. And if you'll find those in the gargoyles that are all over the European churches. Why? Because the artist knew that there was more going on behind the scenes than what people realized. And the church played it off as, look, we've got control over the demons, they're protecting our sacred space. Not quite. But that's a cool story. But she goes through some of the beliefs in ritual human sacrifice, which a lot of that, to be honest with you, was in the Aztec and Mayan cultures of South America. There were a few in the even older times before, the Spanish Crusades and all that kind of stuff into the Americas. It wasn't, as far as what she brings up in here, I'm trying to see if there's any references, because I can't remember off the top of my head. There were deities back in the day. They were, oddly enough, not as popular as people today would like them to be made out to be. Like Moloch, which was an ancient Sumerian or Mesopotamian deity. I can't remember here. Anyway, it was actually reference to a king. It doesn't always mean that it was a deity. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there. But people would do human deletion for Moloch, for Baal, and Kronos, which was a Greek titan. There's some people that say that Saturn had this as well in the Roman culture. There's some art that may say that, but a lot of the history, it's almost feels like it was demonized on purpose. Saturn is the strict father in the Roman pantheon. But it's just interesting because you go through some of this, and so they talk about where the concept of fiery hell came from versus the Tartarus cold hell that's a big labyrinth. And then you get into the more modern times of the different kings, even through the papacy, that practice different forms of demonology and occult. She touches on the burning times during the Dark Ages, where there was the Great Witch Fear. It's also led to the Salem witch trials, which I plan on doing a little bit on that as well, because it is a fascinating time period of WTF. The amount of fear that had been propagated during that time was ridiculous. And it was all over people who used herbs to heal, or were intuitive, or some of them really were, by the definition, witches, but that doesn't mean that they were evil. It was an interesting period of persecution, but she goes through some of that, talking about like the demonic pacts. If you ever get the chance to watch a movie, it's very slow, but it's a slow burn, so it like sticks with you after you're done. Came out a few years ago, called The Witch. It's worth it. But it talks not so much about that movie, because this was written before that, but it's that kind of thing where you have to sign your name in a book, and kind of goes over where that came from, ritual summonings, which is entertaining when you start reading it from a scholarly perspective versus the spiritual side of it. Because in that side, there's a certain, you have to do these practices and you have to build up this certain type of mindset, and they're very elaborate. Let's just start there. But then you look through it from her perspective, where she's a scientist, she's an academic, and she doesn't look at it from a spiritual perspective. She looks at it from the archaeology perspective, and it puts a really different spin on some of that stuff, like good spin, but definitely different. And she goes, like I said, she goes through the shaman exorcisms and the shaman experiences, where exorcism in modern culture is tied almost exclusively to the Catholics. Well, let me just tell you, they adapted and adopted practices that went far older than that. Going back, like she talks about in here, the Dybbuk of Judaism. They've made a really couple of good horror films based on a Dybbuk box. I don't recommend Googling that information because it gets really twisted, and I personally enjoy that kind of stuff, and even there were parts of it where I was like, I'm good, I don't even want to see this. But she talks about the jinn that is Islamic based, which is a fire spirit. It's not the big blue genie from that certain Mouse's movie. It's way more horrific than that. Think Wishmaster is more accurate to what a jinn is. But she even goes through, and I have to give her massive credit for this, talking about the risks to the quote-unquote possessed and the exorcist. What could happen? What has happened? There's been, in the last 100 or so years, I think her earliest source is 95, but there's older sources than that talk about people who may have just had a medical disorder, a mental disorder. I personally believe that you've got both. Sometimes it's psychological, sometimes it actually is possession. But there have been times where people have actually expired because of the exorcist not paying attention to the physical symptoms, because they're trained in a very unique way, the modern day exorcists. And to me, it's not quite the best way, but they do their thing, and that's where we're at. But you go through people who've been around modern day exorcists. There's a Baptist preacher who does them, and I feel like and this is a personal opinion, I feel like he has lost his way. I read his first 2 books back in the 90s when I was still in high school, and he was really fascinating, and when I read his stuff, he was really on point. And from the Christian/Catholic standpoint, he was right on the mark with his exorcisms. But when you see him starting in about 2005 until the present, something's changed. And I can't quite put my finger on it, but I feel like he's played in the darkness a little too long, because things happen. And he actually had a show on, I don't remember what TV channel it was, and it's, to me, comes off as too much theatrics, too much pre-planning, and his response to things is almost insulting to people who are believers and to the spiritual side of life, because he's just, like I said, he's just changed, and I think he's gotten cocky and arrogant, which from all the reading that I've done about this and research, you don't want to go that route. Anyway, but she talks about an interview that she did with, she actually interviewed a modern day exorcist. Where is his name? His name was Bill Bean, and he's been on Lifetime, Discovery, Sci-Fi, Travel, Destination America, Animal Planet, Gaia, Coast to Coast, Beyond Belief, Cornerstone, Dead Files, and the Lifetime Movie Network, if you ever watched that, series called I Was Possessed. Never watched it. But she actually got to interview him for this book. And so she does a really good job of how she lays out this book. She talks about the Nazar amulet, which is the eye, the evil eye. It's a ward. There we go. And it's usually deep blue exterior, white, light blue, and then black. But it's actually a symbol of protection away from evil, and that's why you'll see it very commonly in places. She goes over different cursed objects. There were objects in here I'd never heard of before, like the Bassano vase. Never heard of it. But apparently it kills anyone who possesses it, so it's in a museum right now. There's a movie out called The Boy, and it's based on a painting. There we go. And it was called The Crying Boy. And this one was fun. I actually watched a documentary on this chair. It's Thomas Busby's stoop chair, and even today they have the chair tied to the ceiling so no one will sit in it, because the legend is anyone who sits in it dies that day. So instead of having anyone sit in it, they just have it tied up. But you've got there's mirrors in here that reference, we have them in modern day horror films. I can't remember the name of the movie, but it's a really spooky movie about a haunted mirror. You've got bunk beds that were possessed, dolls, lots and lots of dolls. Obviously, there's a bunch of them about diamonds. There's more mirrors. And a lot of what she thinks, and this is her referencing because she's a scientist, not a believer. I mean, I think she has some beliefs, but she's trying to prove it through a scientific method. But she kind of implies that a lot of it is psychosomatic. Like, people have this very strong belief about an item, and so it triggers a response in their body. And I can't argue with that, but at the same time, there's other things where people have no idea of what it is and it still affects them. And she does reference some of that in here, so her theory is the jury's still out. Then she goes through the different gateways to evil. If you ever watch, there's a couple of different TV series out there, but they talk about people who built hell gates in their house. Why you do that, I don't know. But she talks about some of that kind of stuff, like Mayans, the Transylvanian forest, haunted castles all around the world, different crypts, the most common and popular one being in the labyrinth under Paris, but there's several. There's another one in the Czech Republic. Haunted monasteries and convents are another one that she doesn't do a deep dive in, but she definitely emphasizes, which is absolutely amazing when you look into it. But then she goes through different finds that they can't explain. They don't know why it is here. There's like the pit of severed hands. It's just a giant tomb of hands. There's bogs where they've buried bodies, and you still will see the apparitions of the ghosts there. And I'm playing it off pretty light for a reason. I don't want this to be scary, because to me, I am a firm believer that this stuff exists. I've had my own experiences. But there's some of what she talks about in here. She's talking about it very blatant and blunt, and it comes across as almost a non-belief, and so to me makes it a little bit more entertaining. Talking about things like different sacred animals to demons, like cats in particular. She even has sections in here on vampires. The vampire one's not her big focus. It's the overall relics and the historical documentation that she's into. But she's just really wants to make it clear, and she doesn't say it in here directly, but from the stuff that I have researched over the years, the random rabbit holes I've dove down trying to figure out the source, the answer, fill in the blank, she kind of makes it out that a lot of our old superstitions were based on lack of knowledge of scientific process or lack of understanding of psychological events. That being said, she also has in the last section is kind of a wrap-up of what she thinks, where she found it, why she feels this way. And overall, to me, it's a really interesting book if you are interested in the darker side of life. And she doesn't go into any ritual details. She's literally looking at what's physically available. And then, some police reports and the people who practice, but she doesn't go into the spiritual aspect so much as the archaeological standpoint and looking at it from a person. Like, if you were just to pick up one of these statues, or you're in a museum and you're like, well, that's weird, what's that supposed to be? That's what she's kind of talking about, and giving a little bit of how we ended up with the beliefs that we do in today's culture. So, if you're interested in, like I said, a little bit more darker, a little more sinister, I highly recommend this book. It's, like I said, written from a standpoint of science and logic versus the other aspects, but it's a journey into the dark and weird. And there is a link in the description if you would like to have more information on it or possibly purchase it. With that being said, I will end the video here, and I hope you guys have an awesome rest of your evening, and we will be continuing this day-to-day, either video or live stream, like I said, through the end of December. If you have any comments or suggestions, leave them in the comment section below. And if you have any criticisms, feel free, just be respectful. I think we can all work with a little bit more respect, and especially the stressful time of the holiday season. So I will talk to you guys again later, and have an awesome evening.